October 25, 1944. The Philippine Sea lay cloaked in gray morning mist, still calm before dawn. On the deck of the USS Johnston, sailors wiped condensation from their binoculars, their breaths clouding in the humid air. Somewhere beyond that fog, radar screens began to flicker, strange, massive shapes closing fast. First, no one believed it. The men joked nervously, thinking the radar must be ghosting. After all, they were escorting slow, unarmored escort carriers, baby flat tops, as they were called, not the main fleet. No one expected heavy enemy contact here. But the screens didn't lie. A storm of steel was coming. The crew of Johnston belonged to Task Unit April 3, 77, nicknamed Taffy 3. It was a tiny defensive group. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their job was simple: provide air cover for the troops landing on Leyte, never to engage in a fleet action. They were the smallest of the small, lightly armed, paper-thin ships. Among American sailors, they carried a teasing nickname, tin cans. The Japanese called them worse, scrap metal with guns. And yet, on that morning, those so-called tin cans were about to face the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, fresh from surviving American submarines and air attacks in the San Bernardino Strait, was steaming straight toward them. 23 warships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, her 9 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells the size of Volkswagens. Kurita's mission: annihilate the American landing force at Leyte Gulf. His path? Directly through the helpless Taffy 3. Aboard the Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge. A stocky man with Cherokee blood and the eyes of a fighter, Evans had told his crew months before, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." They'd laughed then, thinking he was half mad, half prophet. Now, as the horizon began to light with fire, his words no longer sounded like bravado. The first Japanese shells screamed overhead just after 06:45. Great geysers of water erupted around the escort carriers, shattering the dawn silence. The men could hear the roar of the 18-inch batteries miles away, a deep, rolling thunder that rattled the hull. One sailor on the Gambier Bay later said it felt like God was splitting the sky open. "Holy hell," muttered the Johnston's helmsman, eyes wide. "Those are battleships. They weren't supposed to be here." American command believed the Japanese surface fleet had been neutralized, scattered by air attacks the day before. But Kurita had doubled back under cover of darkness. Now, against all reason, the might of the Imperial Navy had stumbled upon a handful of American escort ships. Men with almost no armor, limited ammunition, and guns barely big enough to scratch paint on enemy cruisers. Evans didn't hesitate. He shouted down the voice tubes, "General quarters! All hands, battle stations!" Sirens wailed. Men scrambled to their guns, loading 5-inch shells, cutting steam for flank speed. The destroyer's turbines howled. Johnston surged ahead of the formation, slicing through whitecaps. To the north, the Japanese line emerged from the fog, towering silhouettes of battleships and heavy cruisers, their pagoda masts rising like black cathedrals over the ocean. Dozens of muzzle flashes bloomed along their decks. The sea erupted around Taffy 3 in explosions and spray. Radio chatter filled the air. Enemy surface fleet, bearing 270, closing fast. Request immediate air support. But the skies were empty. The only planes available were those from the escort carriers themselves, lightly armed, some carrying only depth charges or machine gun ammo. The situation was hopeless. Yet Evans wasn't built for surrender. Standing on the open bridge, wind tearing at his uniform, he watched the rain of enemy shells and made his decision. "We're going in," he said quietly. His officers stared in disbelief. Going in meant attacking battleships with a destroyer that could be sunk by one hit. But Evans repeated it louder. "We're going in. All engines ahead flank. Smoke screen to cover the carriers. Prepare torpedoes." The Johnston lunged forward, her bow plunging through waves. Black smoke poured from her funnels as she began laying a screen to hide the vulnerable escort carriers behind her. Through binoculars, the crew could see the monstrous shapes of Japanese cruisers closing the Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma. Their broadsides flashed like lightning. Every man aboard knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out-armored 20-1. But none turned away. The deck guns barked. 5-inch rounds spat flame as the destroyer opened fire, aiming at enemy bridges, rangefinders, gun turrets, anything vital. Shells rained down. The sea around Johnston boiled. One hit struck near the bow, shattering radar equipment and killing several crewmen instantly. Another exploded near the aft gun mount, tearing steel like paper. Still the ship surged on. Evans ordered a torpedo attack. Stand by. Tube 1 through 10. Fire. 10 torpedoes streaked through the water, their wakes glowing faintly beneath the surface. Moments later, a thunderous column of flame erupted on the horizon. One torpedo smashed into the Kumano, blowing off her bow. Japanese formations swerved in confusion. The men cheered, but Evans didn't slow. He kept driving closer, 5 miles for 3, until the Johnston was dueling with ships 10 times her size. The 5-inch guns grew so hot that sailors poured buckets of seawater on them to keep them from melting. "Keep firing," Evans shouted. "Don't give them a chance to aim." By now, the sea was chaos. Smoke, flames, tracer arcs, and the shriek of shells filled the air. Johnston's deck was slick with oil and blood. Through the haze, crewmen glimpsed the escort carriers launching every plane they could, pilots improvising attacks with depth charges meant for submarines. The sky filled with streaking dots, American aircraft making desperate dives against massive cruisers. A shell tore through Johnston's engine room. Power flickered. The ship slowed briefly, then recovered. Evans had taken shrapnel to the face, but he refused medical attention. "I'll stay right here," he told his crew, gripping the bridge railing with bloodied hands. At 0720, after 30 minutes of suicidal combat, Johnston broke off to cover another destroyer, the Hoel already burning. Radio calls crackled. "This is Johnston, engaging enemy heavy cruiser. Range 2000 yards. It was madness, 2 kilometers from guns that could reach 15. But it worked. The Japanese fleet faltered. Their commander hesitated, unsure what he was facing. The American ships fought so ferociously, so aggressively, that Kurita believed he'd stumbled into a trap, perhaps the vanguard of the U.S. Third Fleet. In truth, it was just a handful of tin cans. Amid the chaos, a gunner on Johnston looked out at the flaming horizon and whispered, "They said we were too small to matter." Another replied, "Then let's make 'em remember us." Evans smiled faintly at that. "We're not retreating," he said almost to himself. "We're attacking in another direction." The Japanese guns continued their relentless thunder. The ocean itself seemed to shake. Yet the small destroyers held their ground, their defiance burning brighter than their fires. In that hour, no one aboard Johnston, Hoel, or Samuel B. Roberts thought about survival. They thought only of buying time, for the carriers behind them, for the soldiers ashore, for the fleet. As the first hour of battle drew toward its peak, the fog thickened again. The sea churned with wreckage and flame. In the distance, Yamato fired another full salvo, her guns lighting the sky. But the destroyers didn't stop. They were already charging again. They had been mocked as tin cans. They had no armor, only heart. And that morning, against the greatest battleships on Earth, they didn't turn away. They charged head-on. The ocean boiled with fire and steel. By 7:30 a.m., the destroyers of Taffy 3 were surrounded by geysers of seawater as Japanese shells crashed into the sea, towering columns rising higher than the masts themselves. The Johnston had already been hit multiple times, her decks slick with oil and blood. Yet Commander Ernest Evans stood firm on the bridge, shouting orders through the smoke. "Keep her steady. Target that cruiser." The 5-inch guns barked again, their barrels glowing cherry red. Every blast sent a shockwave through the thin steel hull. To the east, the small escort carriers Gambier Bay, Fanshawe Bay, and White Plains scrambled to launch their planes. Pilots who had never trained for naval combat armed their Avengers and Wildcats with whatever they could find. Depth charges, machine gun belts, even makeshift rockets. They knew their weapons couldn't penetrate battleship armor, but they also knew there was no other line of defense. The Japanese fleet was closing fast, its formation like a dark wall rolling out of the mist. Over the radio came the calm, deep voice of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3. All ships, commence retirement. Lay smoke and open fire. We'll make our stand here. The destroyers were to cover the retreat of the carriers. But for Evans, retreat was never an option. He turned to his helmsman. We're going in again. The Johnston swung hard to port, vanishing into her own smoke screen. Sailors could barely see their hands through the haze, yet they reloaded and fired, shouting range numbers over the roar of guns. Then, out of the mist, the hulking shadow of the Japanese cruiser Chikuma appeared, her turrets turning like the eyes of a dragon. Evans made his choice in seconds. All ahead flank. Prepare another torpedo run. The destroyer surged forward, trembling with speed. Enemy shells crashed all around. One struck the forward gun mount, killing everyone inside. The concussion blew men off their feet, shattered portholes, and sent shrapnel ricocheting down the passageways. Still, the crew held to their tasks. The torpedo tubes aligned. Evans raised his binoculars, face streaked with soot and blood. Fire one! The torpedo hissed into the sea, followed by another and another. Within moments, plumes of white water erupted alongside the Chikuma. One torpedo slammed home, detonating beneath her bow. The cruiser shuddered violently, her front turret blown apart. Flames leapt skyward. The Japanese formation faltered as ships veered to avoid their wounded sister. The Johnston had done the impossible, crippled a heavy cruiser with the weapons of a ship that barely displaced 2,000 tons. But victory came at a price. Another enemy salvo slammed into her hull, smashing through the engine room. The ship lost power momentarily. Lights flickered, pumps failed, and black smoke poured from the aft stack. Evans wiped his eyes, blood dripping onto his uniform. Damage control. Get her patched up. Below decks, sailors worked in choking heat, passing buckets of water, sealing ruptured pipes, dragging wounded men out of the flooding compartments. Every clang of metal echoed like a heartbeat. They knew if the boilers failed completely, they'd be dead in the water and dead in minutes. Somehow, the engineers kept the turbines spinning. Meanwhile, the destroyer Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, emerged from the smoke on Johnston's flank, guns blazing. Her silhouette looked almost fragile against the monstrous Japanese battleships looming in the distance. The Yamato herself fired another broadside, 3 18-inch shells arcing through the sky like burning moons. The explosions dwarfed everything around them, lifting water 1,000 feet high. One shell landed just yards from Hoel, drenching her in steam and fragments. The blast cracked her hull plates, but she pressed on, turning directly toward the enemy to launch her own torpedoes. Farther back, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the smallest damn ship in the Navy, charged into the fight at 28 knots. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, shouted over the intercom, "We're going in to attack the heavy cruisers. If we can slow them down, maybe the carriers can escape." His crew cheered. They knew it was suicide, but they cheered anyway. In the skies above, American aircraft dove again and again through anti-aircraft fire. Pilots without bombs used their machine guns to strafe enemy bridges. Some even dropped fuel tanks and empty depth charges to scare the Japanese gunners. One pilot radioed back, his voice cracking, "We're down to bullets and bad language, but we're still in the fight." The Japanese, stunned by the ferocity of this resistance, began to hesitate. Admiral Kurita, aboard his flagship Yamato, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His officers shouted conflicting reports. Enemy carriers to the east, destroyers attacking from the south, torpedoes in the water everywhere. Kurita thought he'd run into the entire U.S. Third Fleet. He didn't realize it was just a handful of escort ships. Still, his heavy cruisers kept advancing. The Chokai, Haguro, and Kumano pounded the Americans with relentless gunfire. The destroyers weaved left and right, their wakes glowing white in the gun flashes. One hit on the Johnston's stern knocked out her steering. Evans took manual control, ordering rudder corrections through runners because the intercom lines were dead. He steered by feel, watching the angle of the horizon, trusting instinct more than instruments. At 8 a.m., Evans saw the escort carrier Gamber Bay on fire. The little ship tried to escape, her deck black with smoke. Planes still launching as flames consumed the stern. Japanese shells tore her apart. The carrier listed sharply, her crew abandoning ship. Evans slammed his fist on the railing, jaw clenched. "We're not done yet," he said. "Not while one of us can still fight." The Johnston limped toward the nearest enemy cruiser, firing her last torpedoes. Every gun still functional opened up. 5-inch shells struck the Chikuma again and again. One American gunner later said, "We fired so fast I couldn't hear myself think. I just kept loading until the barrel glowed white." Then came the counterblow. A full Japanese broadside hit Johnston amidships. The deck split open. Fires roared through compartments. The radio room went silent. Evans' clothes were torn, his cap gone, his face bandaged crudely. Yet he stood firm. "Keep her fighting," he ordered. "Keep firing as long as a single gun will bear." Around him, men dragged ammunition through ankle-deep water. Some fought fires barehanded. Others carried wounded shipmates to the fantail, where medics worked in the open under shellfire. Every man aboard knew the truth. The ship couldn't last much longer. But none stopped. The Samuel B. Roberts, closing from the south, fired her last torpedoes at the Chokai, scoring a hit that blew off her stern. The tiny destroyer escort shook from the recoil of her 5-inch guns. "We're shooting like a battleship," one sailor shouted. When she ran out of shells, they began throwing empty shell casings overboard just to lighten the load and stay afloat. Smoke thickened over the sea. Visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. The Japanese guns thundered blindly, their spotters confused by the smoke and chaos. In that confusion, American courage began to carve an opening. Kurita's line wavered. His flagship turned south to avoid supposed torpedo tracks. The mighty center force was losing momentum, paralyzed by disbelief. Evans could see the enemy withdrawing. His destroyer, riddled with holes, was barely moving, but the sight gave him strength. "We gave them a bloody nose," he muttered, coughing up blood. "Now let's make sure they don't come back." As the morning wore on, Taffy 3's air squadrons made one last desperate assault. Pilots running on fumes strafed burning cruisers and crippled destroyers, forcing the Japanese to break formation completely. The sea was a nightmare of drifting wreckage, smoke, and the cries of wounded men from both sides. By 9 a.m., the Johnston was dead in the water, engines silent. Evans ordered his crew to abandon ship, though he refused to leave the bridge. Witnesses saw him standing tall as the destroyer's stern rose into the air. "Abandon ship!" he shouted one last time before a wave of fire consumed the bridge. Moments later, the Johnston slipped beneath the waves. In the water, survivors clung to debris, watching the Japanese fleet turn away. They couldn't believe it. The giants had retreated. They had fought with courage, bled for each other, and somehow, against the laws of war itself, they had stopped an entire fleet. But none of them yet knew the cost that was still to come. The sea that morning had turned into a vision of hell. Black smoke twisting into the clouds, orange fire rolling across oil-slicked waves, and the echoing thunder of guns so loud they rattled bones. Yet within that chaos, something extraordinary was happening. The tin cans of Taffy 3, the smallest ships in the U.S. Navy, were not breaking. They were attacking. The battered survivors of the Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts had unleashed such fury and confusion that the Japanese center force, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was faltering, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. From above, U.S. pilots circled in disbelief. Lieutenant William Brooks, flying an FM-2 Wildcat, looked down through the haze and radioed, "They're still shooting! My God! Those destroyers are still fighting down there." He dove again, raking a Japanese cruiser with machine gun fire. Below him, the sea shimmered with the flashes of gunfire. American destroyers darting like hornets among the towering black silhouettes of enemy battleships. At 9:15 a.m., the tide of battle began to shift. The Japanese formation, which had started the day as a disciplined wall of steel, was now a scattered, bleeding mass of confusion. Their flagship Yamato had turned away after near misses from torpedoes, her commander fearing another wave of unseen submarines or airstrikes. To the east, several heavy cruisers lay burning. Chikuma crippled, Kumano disemboweled, Chokai dead in the water. And all this had been caused not by American battleships or carrier task forces, but by a ragtag group of destroyers and aircraft armed with little more than courage and desperation. The Japanese officers couldn't understand it. A junior navigator aboard the Yamato reportedly muttered, "They are charging battleships with escort ships. It is madness or genius." To the Americans fighting below deck, there was no time for glory. Aboard Hoel, Commander Kintberger fought to keep his dying ship afloat. Fires raged from stem to stern, but his gunners continued to fire. When ammunition ran low, sailors passed shells hand to hand like a bucket brigade, each explosion from the forward guns shaking the hull. One gun captain, his face black with soot, yelled over the noise, "If we're going down, let's take one of them with us." The Hoel absorbed over 40 shell hits before she finally stopped moving. Her power gone, the Japanese cruisers circled her like wolves. Even as she sank, her last remaining gun fired a final defiant salvo before the deck disappeared under the waves. Survivors leapt into the burning sea, clutching rafts and debris. One sailor later recalled hearing Kintberger's last order, "You fought like hell, boys. Don't ever forget it." Meanwhile, the Samuel B. Roberts was still in the fight. Though barely over 1,300 tons, she was hammering away at the Chokai, her guns firing at a rate so furious that crewmen feared the barrels would burst. Her crew nicknamed her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Every time a shell found its mark, men cheered through the smoke. Her helmsman kept dodging incoming salvos, turning at the last second as geysers exploded beside them. When a shell finally struck the engine room, sending steam hissing through the corridors, her captain, Robert Copeland, gave the order to abandon ship, but not before one last message was sent over the radio. "We're going down fighting. Give 'em hell, boys." That message crackled across the task force frequencies, and for a moment, every ship and plane within range felt it like electricity in their veins. Pilots above clenched their jaws, diving even lower. Some had no ammunition left at all but continued mock attacks, swooping over Japanese ships to draw their fire. Others dropped whatever they had, empty fuel tanks, pistols, even flares, to keep the enemy gunners distracted. The Japanese formation was breaking apart under the relentless assault. Admiral Kurita watched from the bridge of Yamato, his mind reeling. He had started the morning with one of the largest battle fleets ever assembled. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Now, after just a few hours of combat, 3 of his cruisers were gone, 2 more were crippled, and his force was scattered across dozens of miles of ocean. He didn't understand what he was facing. Every instinct told him he should be fighting the main U.S. fleet, but this didn't look like a major task force. It looked like a handful of small escort ships and carrier planes. And yet, those small ships had fought with such suicidal ferocity that they'd convinced him otherwise. Kurita's hesitation grew. His staff officers urged him to press on. The American landing forces were still vulnerable on Leyte. If they could break through, Japan might still snatch a victory from defeat. But reports flooded in. More torpedoes, more air attacks, more burning ships. Kurita's nerves, already frayed from days of constant bombardment, snapped. At 9:20 a.m., he gave the order, "All ships, turn to the north. Regroup." The order spread like wildfire through the Japanese radios. Some captains, shocked, hesitated to obey. Others thought it was a temporary maneuver. But as the massive battleships and cruisers began to swing away, the truth dawned. The center force was retreating. From the air, American pilots watching the enemy fleet turning away could hardly believe it. "They're running!" shouted one aviator. "By God! They're running!" The message spread through the task group. Wounded sailors cheered from their life rafts. On the remaining escort carriers, the bridge crews exchanged disbelieving looks. Against all logic, they had turned back the mightiest fleet Japan had left. It wasn't just a tactical miracle, it was psychological warfare at its most human level. The Japanese Navy, raised on ideals of superiority and glory, could not comprehend being checked by such fragile opponents. To them, the U.S. destroyers were supposed to scatter at the first sight of battleships. Instead, they had charged directly into their guns. It broke the illusion of invincibility. By 10 a.m., the guns fell silent. The ocean, still littered with burning ships, was eerily calm. Survivors floated in the wreckage, watching the enemy fade into the horizon. The Johnston was gone. The Hoel was gone. The Samuel B. Roberts was gone. Yet, in their sacrifice, they had saved not only Taffy 3, but perhaps the entire American landing force at Leyte. Back aboard the remaining carriers, Admiral Sprague tried to take stock of what had just happened. His command was shattered, but the Japanese fleet had fled. "We owe those destroyers everything," he said quietly. "They saved the whole damned operation." Later, as the reports came in, the scale of the victory became clear. The U.S. lost 3 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 1 carrier. The Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers, 3 more crippled, and countless planes and men. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. The heart of it was courage, the kind that defied logic and strategy. In Washington, when news of the engagement reached Admiral Nimitz, he reportedly stood in silence for a long moment before saying, "Those boys at Samar, they were magnificent." Historians would later call it the most heroic naval action of World War II. Others would call it the greatest mismatch in naval history. But to the men who fought it, it was simpler than that. It was a fight for their brothers, for the carriers they swore to protect, for the belief that no ship was too small to stand its ground. As the sun dipped low over the Pacific that day, the survivors drifting among the wreckage looked out toward the horizon. The sea was still burning, the air thick with smoke. One sailor from the Johnston whispered, "We didn't lose. We just ran out of ship." And somewhere beyond the mist, the Yamato, the pride of Japan, was retreating from ghosts made of steel and grit. Against all odds, the tin cans had done the unthinkable. They had turned back giants. The sea was quiet again. The monstrous guns that had shaken the morning sky were now silent, their echoes fading into the horizon. In their place came the sounds of survival, the slap of waves against floating debris, the faint cries of wounded men, and the whisper of wind through drifting smoke. The battle off Samar was over, but for the survivors of Taffy 3, the war had not ended. It had only changed form. Hundreds of sailors from the Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gamber Bay now floated in the vast Pacific, scattered across miles of open ocean. Oil from shattered fuel lines spread around them in a black sheen that clung to their faces and uniforms. The sun climbed higher, turning the oil into a mirror that burned their skin. The sea, once their ally, had become an endless expanse of pain and thirst. Many were wounded, their bandages soaked with salt water. Some clung to rafts made of splintered deck planks. Others floated in life jackets that barely kept them above the surface. There were no rescue ships yet. Japanese vessels had withdrawn, and the nearest American task groups were hundreds of miles away. The survivors could only hope that someone had seen the battle smoke or picked up their distress signals. Among them were men who had watched their ships go down, men who had seen their captains, their friends, their gunners die at their posts. Some were too weak to speak. Others whispered stories to keep each other awake. A sailor from Samuel B. Roberts later recalled, "We were proud, even while dying. We'd fought giants and we hadn't run. Hours turned into a day, then 2. The sun blistered their skin by day and the cold pierced their bones at night. Sharks began to circle, drawn by the scent of blood and oil. Survivors kicked at them with boots and paddles, shouting prayers into the dark. One man began reciting the names of the ships, as if keeping them alive by saying them aloud. Johnston, Hull, Roberts, Gambier Bay. Another quietly sang America the Beautiful until his voice gave out. When rescue finally came, it was by chance. Search planes from the Fanshawe Bay and other carriers spotted clusters of men drifting near the wreck site. Destroyers and patrol craft were dispatched immediately. For many, it was too late. Over 800 sailors from Taffy 3 had perished in the water. Those who were pulled aboard rescue ships were half mad with dehydration, some still saluting through cracked lips. But even as they recovered, none of them spoke of defeat. Every man knew what they had done. Against the largest battleships ever built, they had stood their ground. They had protected the carriers, saved the landing force at Leyte, and changed the course of the Pacific War. News of the battle spread slowly at first, then exploded across the Allied command. Reports called it the battle that should never have been won. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the dispatches in silence. He understood the magnitude of what had happened. A small escort group, hopelessly outmatched, had stopped Japan's last major naval offensive. Without Taffy 3's stand, the landings at Leyte could have been destroyed, and the recapture of the Philippines delayed for months. The American press would later call the men of Taffy 3 the bravest sailors in the Pacific. But among the survivors, there was no boasting. They spoke of the fallen instead. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the Johnston was missing, presumed dead. His crew had last seen him on the bridge, giving orders as the ship sank beneath the waves. For his valor, Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive it. His citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, his actions and those of his men became legend." The Samuel B. Roberts crew received similar recognition. One historian later wrote that she fought so hard, her guns fired faster than any destroyer escort in history. The Hoel and Gambier Bay were honored for their sacrifice. Even the aircraft that had fought with empty guns were credited with saving the fleet. In Japan, the reaction was one of disbelief and quiet respect. Many Japanese officers had grown up believing that only their sailors possessed the spirit of self-sacrifice. Yet the battle off Samar had shattered that illusion. Admiral Kurita himself admitted later, "I turned away from victory because I could not believe my eyes. Those small ships fought like lions." The irony was complete. The same destroyers the Japanese had laughed at, those tin cans meant only for escort duty, had driven back the most powerful battleships in the world. The insult had become a badge of honor. After Samar, American sailors wore the nickname Tin Can Sailors with pride. It came to symbolize something larger than steel or firepower, the raw courage of ordinary men standing against impossible odds. In the months that followed, the U.S. Navy advanced deeper into the Pacific. Japan's surface fleet never fully recovered from the loss at Leyte Gulf. The Yamato herself would die just months later, sunk by American carrier planes during her final desperate sortie to Okinawa. When she went down, sailors across the Pacific remembered that the first time the giant had turned away was not from aircraft, but from destroyers. For the veterans of Taffy 3, life after the war carried the weight of memory. Reunions in later decades were filled with laughter, tears, and quiet silences. Some survivors never spoke of the battle at all. Others could recount every sound, every flash of light, as if it had happened yesterday. They remembered Evans' voice, calm amid chaos. They remembered the feel of the deck vibrating under gunfire. They remembered the sea swallowing their ship. At the Naval Academy, the story of Samar became required reading. Midshipmen studied it not for its tactics, but for its spirit, the embodiment of duty and defiance. The lessons were clear. Technology changes, but courage endures. Years later, in 2019, deep-sea explorers found the wreck of the Johnston more than 21,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The ship lay shattered, but her guns still pointed toward where the enemy had been. It was as if she had never stopped fighting. When the footage reached surviving family members, many wept. One sailor's son said, "She's still standing guard." The story of Taffy 3 remains one of the U.S. Navy's proudest moments, not because of victory in the traditional sense, but because of what it revealed about the human spirit. It proved that courage and duty could defy logic, that the heart of a crew could outweigh the tonnage of a fleet. And as the decades passed, the moral of the story only grew stronger. In every war, in every generation, there are those who fight not because they expect to win, but because they refuse to run. Samar was their testament. They called us tin cans, one survivor once said, but they forgot. Tin floats. The calm ocean that now covers those wrecks has no memory of the fire and thunder that once tore across it. Yet deep beneath the waves, among rusted guns and twisted steel, lies the echo of a promise. That courage, once kindled, never dies. In the end, it wasn't the size of the ship that mattered. It was the size of the men aboard her. So when the question comes, what drives a man to charge a battleship with a destroyer? The answer is simple. Duty, brotherhood, the refusal to let fear decide the outcome. And perhaps that is the lesson for all time. In an age of drones and missiles, of machines and distance, Samar reminds us that wars are still won by men who stand their ground. The sea took them, but it also carried their story forever. Which modern machine, built for precision and power, will one day meet its own tin can, underestimated, outmatched, but unbreakable?